Brought to you by WikiVD Documentaries. Brazil. Brazil, officially the Federative Republic of Brazil, is the largest country in both South America and Latin America, besides being the largest of the Americas by continental area. As the world's fifth largest country by both area and population, it is the largest country to have Portuguese as an official language, and the only one in the Americas. Bounded by the Atlantic Ocean on the east, Brazil has a coastline of it borders all other South American countries except Ecuador and Chile, and covers 47.3% of the continent's land area. Its Amazon River basin includes a vast tropical forest, home to diverse wildlife, a variety of ecological systems, and extensive natural resources spanning numerous protected habitats. This unique environmental heritage makes Brazil one of 17 megadiverse countries, and is the subject of significant global interest and debate regarding deforestation and environmental protection. Brazil was inhabited by numerous tribal nations prior to the landing in 1500 of explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral, who claimed the area for the Portuguese Empire. Brazil remained a Portuguese colony until 1808, when the capital of the empire was transferred from Lisbon to Rio de Janeiro. In 1815, the colony was elevated to the rank of kingdom upon the formation of the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. Independence was achieved in 1822 with the creation of the Empire of Brazil, a unitary state governed under a constitutional monarchy and a parliamentary system. The ratification of the first constitution in 1824 led to the formation of a bicameral legislature, now called the National Congress. The country became a presidential republic in 1889 following a military coup d'état. An authoritarian military junta came to power in 1964 and ruled until 1985, after which civilian governance resumed. Brazil's current constitution, formulated in 1988, defines it as a democratic federal republic. The federation is composed of the Union of the Federal District, the 26 states, and the 5,570 municipalities. Brazil's economy is the world's 9th largest by nominal GDP, and 8th largest by GDP. A member of the BRICS group, Brazil until 2010 had one of the world's fastest-growing major economies, with its economic reforms giving the country new international recognition and influence. Brazil's National Development Bank plays an important role for the country's economic growth. Brazil is a founding member of the United Nations, the G20, BRICS, UNASUL, Mercosul, Organization of American States, Organization of Ibero-American States, and the CPLP. Brazil is a regional power in Latin America and a middle power in international affairs, with some analysts identifying it as an emerging global power. One of the world's major breadbaskets, Brazil has been the largest producer of coffee for the last 150 years. Etymology. It is likely that the word Brazil comes from the Portuguese word for Brazilwood, a tree that once grew plentifully along the Brazilian coast. In Portuguese, Brazilwood is called pau-Brasil, with the word Brazil commonly given the etymology red like an ember, formed from Latin brasa and the suffix -il. As Brazilwood produces a deep, red dye, it was highly valued by the European cloth industry, and was the earliest commercially exploited product from Brazil. Throughout the 16th century, massive amounts of Brazilwood were harvested by indigenous peoples along the Brazilian coast, who sold the timber to European traders in return for assorted European consumer goods. The official Portuguese name of the land, in original Portuguese records, was the Land of the Holy Cross, but European sailors and merchants commonly called it simply the Land of Brazil, on account of the Brazilward trade. The popular appellation eclipsed and eventually supplanted the official Portuguese name. Early sailors sometimes also called it the Land of Parrots. In the Guarani language, an official language of Paraguay, Brazil is called Pindrama. This was the name the indigenous population gave to the region, meaning Land of the Palm Trees. Pre-Cabraline era. The earliest human remains found in the Americas, Lucia woman, were found in the area of Pedro Leopoldo, Minas Gerais, and provide evidence of human habitation going back at least 11,000 years.
The earliest pottery ever found in the Western Hemisphere was excavated in the Amazon basin of Brazil and radiocarbon dated to 8,000 years ago. The pottery was found near Santarém, and provides evidence that the tropical forest region supported a complex prehistoric culture. Around the time of the Portuguese arrival, the territory of current-day Brazil had an estimated indigenous population of 7 million people, mostly semi-nomadic who subsisted on hunting, fishing, gathering, and migrant agriculture.
The indigenous population of Brazil comprised several large indigenous ethnic groups. The Tupi people were subdivided into the Tupi-Iguans and Tupinambas, and there were also many subdivisions of the other groups. Before the arrival of the Europeans, the boundaries between these groups and their subgroups were marked by wars that arose from differences in culture, language and moral beliefs.
These wars also involved large-scale military actions on land and water, with cannibalistic rituals on prisoners of war. While heredity had some weight, leadership status was more subdued over time, than allocated in succession ceremonies and conventions. Slavery among the Indians had a different meaning than it had for Europeans, since it originated from a diverse socio-economic organization, in which asymmetries were translated into kinship relations.
Portuguese colonization. The land now called Brazil was claimed for the Portuguese Empire on the 22nd of April 1500. With the arrival of the Portuguese fleet commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral, the Portuguese encountered indigenous peoples divided into several tribes, most of whom spoke languages of the Tupi-Guarani family, and fought among themselves. Though the first settlement was founded in 1532, colonization was effectively begun in 1534, when King Dom João III of Portugal divided the territory into the 15 private and autonomous captaincy colonies of Brazil. However, the decentralized and unorganized tendencies of the captaincy colonies proved problematic, and in 1549 the Portuguese king restructured them into the Governorate General of Brazil, a single and centralized Portuguese colony in South America. In the first 2 centuries of colonization, indigenous and European groups lived in constant war, establishing opportunistic alliances in order to gain advantages against each other. By the mid-16th century, cane sugar had become Brazil's most important exportation product, and slaves purchased in sub-Saharan Africa, in the slave market of Western Africa, had become its largest import. To cope with plantations of sugarcane, due to increasing international demand for Brazilian sugar, by the end of the 17th century, sugarcane exports began to decline, and the discovery of gold by Bandeirantes in the 1690s would become the new backbone of the colony's economy, fostering a Brazilian gold rush which attracted thousands of new settlers to Brazil from Portugal and all Portuguese colonies around the world. This increased level of immigration in turn caused some conflicts between newcomers and old settlers. Portuguese expeditions known as bandeiras gradually advanced the Portugal colonial original frontiers in South America to approximately the current Brazilian borders.
In this era, other European powers tried to colonize parts of Brazil in incursions that the Portuguese had to fight, notably the French in Rio during the 1560s, in Maranhão during the 1610s, and the Dutch in Bahia and Pernambuco during the Dutch-Portuguese War, after the end of Iberian Union.
The Portuguese colonial administration in Brazil had two objectives that would ensure colonial order and the monopoly of Portugal's wealthiest and largest colony, to keep under control and eradicate all forms of slave rebellion and resistance, such as the Quilombo of Palmares, and to repress all movements for autonomy or independence, such as the Minas Conspiracy. United Kingdom with Portugal. In late 1807, Spanish and Napoleonic forces threatened the security of continental Portugal, causing Prince Regent João, in the name of Queen Maria I, to move the royal court from Lisbon to Brazil. There they established some of Brazil's first financial institutions, such as its local stock exchanges, and its national bank, additionally ending the Portuguese monopoly on Brazilian trade and opening Brazil to other nations. In 1809, in retaliation for being forced into exile, the Prince Regent ordered the Portuguese conquest of French Guiana.
With the end of the Peninsular War in 1814, the courts of Europe demanded that Queen Maria I and Prince Regent João return to Portugal, deeming it unfit for the head of an ancient European monarchy to reside in a colony. In 1815, in order to justify continuing to live in Brazil, where the royal court had thrived for the past 6 years, the Crown established the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves, thus creating a pluricontinental transatlantic monarchic state. However, such a ploy didn't last long, since the leadership in Portugal, resentful with the new status of its larger colony, continued to require the return of court to Lisbon, as well as groups of Brazilians, impatient for practical and real changes, still demanded independence and a republic, as showed by the 1817 Pernambucan Revolt. In 1821, as a demand of revolutionaries who had taken the city of Porto, João was unable to hold out any longer, and departed for Lisbon. There he swore oath to the new constitution, leaving his son, Prince Pedro de Alcântara, as regent of the Kingdom of Brazil.
Independent Empire. Tensions between Portuguese and Brazilians increased, and the Portuguese Cortes, guided by the new political regime imposed by the 1820 Liberal Revolution, tried to re-establish Brazil as a colony. The Brazilians refused to yield, and Prince Pedro decided to stand with them, declaring the country's independence from Portugal on 7 September 1822.
A month later, Prince Pedro was declared the first emperor of Brazil, with the regnal title of Dom Pedro I, resulting in the foundation of the Empire of Brazil. The Brazilian War of Independence, which had already begun along this process, spread through northeastern regions and in Cisplatina province,
with the last Portuguese soldiers surrendering on 8 March 1824. Portugal officially recognized Brazil on 29 August 1825. On 7 April 1831, worn down by years of administrative turmoil and political dissensions with both liberal and conservative sides of politics, including an attempt of republican secession, as well as unreconciled with the way that absolutists in Portugal had given to the succession of King John VI, Pedro I went to Portugal to reclaim his daughter's crown. abdicating the Brazilian throne in favor of his 5-year-old son and heir.
As the new emperor could not exert his constitutional powers until he became of age, a regency was set up by the National Assembly. In the absence of a charismatic figure who could represent a moderate face of power. During this period a series of localized rebellions took place, as the Cabanajam, the Male Revolt, the Baleada, the Sabinada, and the Ragamuffin War, which emerged from the dissatisfaction of the provinces with the central power, coupled with old and latent social tensions peculiar of a vast slaveholding and newly independent nation-state.
This period of internal political and social upheaval, which included the Pre-Era Revolt, was overcome only at the end of the 1840s, years after the end of the Regency, which occurred with the premature coronation of Pedro II in 1841. During the last phase of the monarchy, internal political debate was centered on the issue of slavery. The Atlantic slave trade was abandoned in 1850, as a result of the British Aberdeen Act, but only in May 1888 after a long process of internal mobilization and debate for an ethical and legal dismantling of slavery in the country, was the institution formally abolished. The foreign affairs in the monarchy were basically related issues with the countries of the Southern Cone with which Brazil has borders. Long after the Cisplatin War that resulted in independence for Uruguay, Brazil won 3 international wars during the 58-year reign of Pedro II. These were the Platin War, the Uruguayan War and the devastating Paraguayan War, the largest war effort in Brazilian history. On 15 November 1889, worn out by years of economic stagnation, in attrition with the majority of army officers, as well as with rural and financial elites, the monarchy was overthrown by a military coup. Early Republic. The early Republican government was little more than a military dictatorship, with army dominating affairs both at Rio de Janeiro and in the States. Freedom of the press disappeared and elections were controlled by those in power. In 1894, following the unfoldings of 2 severe crises, an economic along with her military one, the Republican civilians rose to power. If in relation to its foreign policy, the country in this first Republican period maintained a relative balance characterized by success in resolving border disputes with neighboring countries, only broken by the Acre War, and its involvement in World War I, followed by a failed attempt to exert a prominent role in the League of Nations. Internally, from the crises of Ensalamento and the Armada revolts, a prolonged cycle of financial, political, and social instability began until the 1920s, keeping the country besieged by various rebellions, both civilian and military. Little by little, a cycle of general instability sparked by these crises undermined the regime to such an extent that in the wake of the murder of his running mate, the defeated opposition presidential candidate Getulio Vargas, supported by most of the military, successfully led the October 1930s coup. Vargas and the military were supposed to assume power temporarily, but instead closed the Congress, extinguished the Constitution, ruled with emergency powers and replaced the state's governors with their own supporters. In the 1930s, 3 failed attempts to remove Vargas and his supporters from power occurred. The first was the Constitutionalist Revolt in 1932 led by the Paulista oligarchy. The second was a communist uprising in November 1935, and the last one a putsch attempt by the local fascists in May 1938. The 1935 uprising created a security crisis in which the Congress transferred more power to the executive. The 1937 coup d'etat resulted in the cancellation of the 1938 election, installed Vargas as a dictator, and began the Estado Novo era, noted for government brutality and censorship of the press. The foreign policy during Vargas' years was marked by the antecedents and occurrence of World War II, having Brazil remained neutral until August 1942, when the country entered on the Allied side, after suffering retaliations undertaken by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, in the context of the strategic dispute over the South Atlantic. In addition to its participation in the Battle of the Atlantic, Brazil also sent an expeditionary force to fight in the Italian campaign. With the Allied victory in 1945 and the end of the Nazi-fascist regimes in Europe, Vargas' position became unsustainable and he was swiftly overthrown in another military coup, with democracy being reinstated by the same army that had discontinued it 15 years earlier. Vargas committed suicide in August 1954 amid a political crisis, after having returned to power by election in 1950. Contemporary era. Several brief interim governments succeeded after Vargas' suicide. Juscelino Kubitschek became president in 1956 and assumed a conciliatory posture towards the political opposition that allowed him to govern without major crises. The economy and industrial sector grew remarkably, but his greatest achievement was the construction of the new capital city of Brasilia, inaugurated in 1960. His successor was Jânio Quadros, who resigned in 1961, less than a year after taking office. His vice president, João Goulart, assumed the presidency, but aroused strong political opposition and was deposed in April 1964 by a coup that resulted in a military regime. The new regime was intended to be transitory, but it gradually closed in on itself and became a full dictatorship. With the promulgation of the Fifth Institutional Act in 1968, the oppression was not limited to only those who resorted to guerrilla tactics to fight the regime, but also reached institutional opponents, artists, journalists and other members of civil society, inside and outside the country. Despite its brutality, like other totalitarian regimes in history, due to an economic boom, known as an economic miracle, the regime reached its highest level of popularity in the early 1970s. Slowly, however, the wear and tear of years of dictatorial power that had not slowed the repression, even after the defeat of the leftist guerrillas, plus the inability to deal with the economic crises of the period and popular pressure, made an opening policy inevitable, which from the regime side was led by Generals Geisel and Golbery. With the enactment of the amnesty law in 1979, Brazil began its slow return to democracy, which would be completed during the 1980s. Civilians returned to power in 1985, when José Sarney assumed the presidency, becoming unpopular during his tenure due to his failure in controlling the economic crisis and hyperinflation inherited from the military regime. Sarney's unsuccessful government allowed the election in 1989 of the almost unknown Fernando Collor, who was subsequently impeached by the National Congress in 1992. Collor was succeeded by his vice president Itamar Franco, who appointed Fernando Henrique Cardoso as Minister of Finance. In 1994, Cardoso produced a highly successful plano reel that, after decades of failed economic plans made by previous governments attempting to curb hyperinflation, finally granted stability to the Brazilian economy, leading Cardoso to be elected that year, and again in 1998. The peaceful transition of power from Fernando Henrique to his main opposition leader, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, was seen as a proof that Brazil had finally succeeded in achieving a long-sought political stability. However, sparked by indignation and frustrations accumulated over decades, numerous peaceful protests erupted in Brazil from the middle of first term of Dilma Rousseff, enhanced by a political and economic crises with evidences of involvement of politicians from all main political parties in several bribery and tax evasion schemes. With large street protests for and against her, Rousseff was impeached by the Brazilian Congress in 2016. Geography. Brazil occupies a large area along the eastern coast of South America, and includes much of the continent's interior, sharing land borders with Uruguay to the south, Argentina and Paraguay to the southwest, Bolivia and Peru to the west, Colombia to the northwest,
and Venezuela, Guyana, Suriname and France to the north. It shares a border with every South American country except Ecuador and Chile. It also encompasses a number of oceanic archipelagos, such as Fernando de Noronha, Rocas Atoll, St. Peter and Paul Rocks, and Trindade and Martin Vaz. Its size, relief, climate, and natural resources make Brazil geographically diverse, including its Atlantic highlands. Brazil lies between latitudes 6 degrees north and 34 degrees south, and longitudes 28 degrees and 74 degrees west.
Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world, and third largest in the Americas, with a total area of, including of water. It spans 4 time zones, from UTC-5 comprising the state of Acre and the westernmost portion of Amazonas, to UTC-4 in the western states, to UTC-3 in the eastern states and UTC-2 in the Atlantic islands.
Brazil is the only country in the world that has the equator and the Tropic of Capricorn running through it. It is also the only country to have contiguous territory both inside and outside the tropics. Brazilian topography is also diverse and includes hills, mountains, plains, highlands, and scrublands. Much of the terrain lies between and in elevation.
The main upland area occupies most of the southern half of the country. The northwestern parts of the plateau consist of broad, rolling terrain broken by low, rounded hills. The southeastern section is more rugged, with a complex mass of ridges and mountain ranges reaching elevations of up to. These ranges include the Mantiqueira and Espinhaco Mountains and the Serra de Mar. In the north, the Guiana Highlands form a major drainage divide, separating rivers that flow south into the Amazon basin from rivers that empty into the Orinoco River system, in Venezuela, to the north.
The highest point in Brazil is the Pico de Neblina, and the lowest is the Atlantic Ocean. Brazil has a dense and complex system of rivers, one of the world's most extensive, with 8 major drainage basins, all of which drain into the Atlantic. Major rivers include the Amazon, the Paraná and its major tributary the Iguaçu, the Negro, São Francisco, Xingu, Madeira and Tapajós rivers.
Climate. The climate of Brazil comprises a wide range of weather conditions across a large area and varied topography, but most of the country is tropical. According to the Köppen system, Brazil hosts 5 major climatic subtypes: equatorial, tropical, semi-arid, highland tropical, temperate, and subtropical. The different climatic conditions produce environments ranging from equatorial rainforests in the north and semi-arid deserts in the northeast, to temperate coniferous forests in the south and tropical savannas in central Brazil.
Many regions have starkly different microclimates. An equatorial climate characterizes much of northern Brazil. There is no real dry season, but there are some variations in the period of the year when most rain falls. Temperatures average, with more significant temperature variation between night and day than between seasons. Over central Brazil, rainfall is more seasonal, characteristic of a savanna climate. This region is as extensive as the Amazon basin, but has a very different climate as it lies farther south at a higher altitude.
In the interior northeast, seasonal rainfall is even more extreme. The semi-arid climatic region generally receives less than of rain, most of which generally falls in a period of 3 to 5 months of the year and occasionally less than this, creating long periods of drought. Brazil's 1877-78 Grand Seca, the worst in Brazil's history, caused approximately 500,000 deaths.
A similarly devastating drought occurred in 1915, south of Bahia, near the coasts, and more southerly most of the state of São Paulo. The distribution of rainfall changes, with rain falling throughout the year. The south enjoys subtropical conditions, with cool winters, and average annual temperatures not exceeding winter frosts, and snowfall are not rare in the highest areas.
Biodiversity and environment. Brazil's large territory comprises different ecosystems, such as the Amazon rainforest, recognized as having the greatest biological diversity in the world, with the Atlantic forest and the Cerrado sustaining the greatest biodiversity. In the south, the Araucaria pine forest grows under temperate conditions.
The rich wildlife of Brazil reflects the variety of natural habitats. Scientists estimate that the total number of plant and animal species in Brazil could approach 4 million, mostly invertebrates. Larger mammals include carnivores, pumas, jaguars, ocelots, rare bush dogs, and foxes. And herbivores, peccaries, tapirs, anteaters, sloths, opossums, and armadillos.
Deer are plentiful in the south, and many species of New World monkeys are found in the northern rainforests. Concern for the environment has grown in response to global interest in environmental issues. Brazil's Amazon basin is home to an extremely diverse array of fish species, including the red-bellied piranha. Despite its reputation as a ferocious freshwater fish, the red-bellied piranha is actually a generally timid scavenger. Biodiversity can contribute to agriculture, livestock, forestry and fisheries extraction. However, almost all economically exploited species of plants, such as soybeans and coffee, or animals, such as chickens, are imported from other countries, and the economic use of native species still crawls. In the Brazilian GDP, the forest sector represents just over 1% and fishing 0.4%. The natural heritage of Brazil is severely threatened by cattle ranching and agriculture. Logging, mining, resettlement, oil and gas extraction, overfishing, wildlife trade, dams and infrastructure, water pollution, climate change, fire, and invasive species. In many areas of the country, the natural environment is threatened by development. Construction of highways has opened up previously remote areas for agriculture and settlement. Dams have flooded valleys and inundated wildlife habitats, and mines have scarred and polluted the landscape. At least 70 dams are said to be planned for the Amazon region, including the controversial Belo Monte hydroelectric dam. Thank you for watching. Brought to you by WikiVD Documentaries. Please like and subscribe below. Please like and subscribe below.